Good afternoon to all, and welcome to Toronto Institute of Palliative Science, and welcome all of you to PalliCovid ECHO-5. And today we have sessions on dealing with psychosocial and spiritual issues and burnout in context of COVID-19. The sessions carried out by Ms. SMRITI Madam, and over to Sunil to facilitate this session.
Good afternoon, and welcome you to this fifth session on COVID-19. So we have been talking mainly about communication and other symptom management, but today we are going to talk about the psychosocial interventions that need to be done in COVID-19. We know that this problem is acute, so the patient lives at home or at another care center will be going to the COVID care center, so the patient may feel isolation, and there is stigma of COVID-19, and we are hearing news about this. So there are many problems the patient and family experiences. So we will hear from SMRITI what can be done, what are the problems the patient and family face in this situation. SMRITI RANA is the program director of PalliCovid India, and basically she is a psychologist and has been working in connection with the palliative care for many years. So welcome, SMRITI, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil. Pleasure to be here, and happy to have a psychosocial component. As we all know, that health is not just the absence of infirmity and disease, but also the presence of well-being. And so much of our well-being is has to do with our emotional health and mental health. Usually this particular module is taken by my colleague, Dr. Chitra Venkatesh, but she's not available today, so I'm going to be covering for her. So I'd like to thank her for putting the module together, and as with the rest of these modules that have been created specifically for palliative care in the COVID context, a lot of hard work has gone in. So thank you, Dr. Chitra. I'm going to start sharing my presentation. Okay. So, making sense of distress in the context of COVID-19 is what we are talking about. When we talk about psychosocial distress, psychosocial well-being, a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are now facing an unprecedented challenge. None of us have really faced something like this before. And before we can start coping with it healthily, we also have to sort of disentangle what it really means for us. So I'm going to try and approach it from that perspective. What we will learn today is to understand the relevance of psychosocial issues in COVID-19. There is evidence that has already started coming in, so we're going to be looking at that. We will learn to identify and assess emotional distress and have knowledge of specific issues related to COVID. There is an algorithm. I hope all of you have downloaded the ebook, and there is an algorithm in the ebook that specifically deals with psychological distress. And you can find that algorithm. It's number 4, the algorithm number 4. And we will also be working on understanding the spiritual domain of distress, which is such an important part of what we're all going through at the moment. I'm going to also ask you to download the supporting documents or look at the supporting documents on page 42 of the ebook. And you'll find a lot of what we discuss today there in detail. So let's begin with a story that all of us go through. At this point, at this very unprecedented point in history, what could be going through your mind? I know all of you here are healthcare providers associated with delivery of healthcare at some level or the other. Some of you might be on the front lines, some of you maybe not on the front lines, but also involved. None of us can really escape what is happening around us. So what could be some things that are going through your mind? Just the sheer, there are days when I wake up and I think, my God, when did this happen? How is this happening like this? So, there are those kind of thoughts that never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that I would see something, a day like this. There is also the surreal, it feels surreal sometimes. Specifically, if you are affected by something, then that question of why is this happening to me? How is this happening to me, to my family? That question rises. If you're a healthcare worker, you might also have these questions of, am I doing enough? Am I doing what I was trained for? Not all of us may be out there, and there is also this guilt of how am I not being able to help others? And those kind of questions. There are people who are separated because of the quarantine, because of isolation, because of the lockdown, and your thoughts could be racing about people that you're not with physically at that moment. It could be a young woman whose elderly parents are far away and she's concerned for them because they're vulnerable. It could be the fact, or it could be the reverse, where the mother is worried about the daughter. It could be that somebody in the family is a healthcare worker. There could be someone who is who's unable to come back home for a variety of reasons. So there are all these different thoughts that might be going through our minds at a time like this. And what we're experiencing also, what is unique about the situation is that usually we're used to events taking place in silos. I don't know how many of us have ever experienced something like this, which is affecting us at a global level. There is not a country today that is not part of this narrative, right? And there is so much uncertainty, and in a sense, everybody is trying to cope with their own sort of uh, you know uh, the mystery of what is going to happen. And what we're also experiencing is a collective loss. And this is a very powerful thing. It is a thing that none of us can really escape at this point. We're also experiencing a loss of meaning. There's tons of grief that is floating around. There's a lot of blame. I'm sure if you just pick up the newspaper, you're going to see all of these things also represented. Tremendous amounts of anxiety. I think each of us have felt some level of anxiety, some more serious than others in the last few months, ever since this whole pandemic began. And there's also this, apart from the spikes in anxiety, there's also like this low-grade anxiety that tends to follow a lot of us everywhere. Families have been separated. Poverty, we're seeing a huge, sharp spike in poverty because of loss of jobs, because of all the displacement. There's homelessness. There's an exodus of people being, moved around. There's a lot of bewilderment and dread. There is a sense of catastrophe. It's like the apocalypse. It's like the end of the world. It feels like that. And palliative care has historically so heavily relied on being present with patients and families, and that is something that we're not being able to do to the best of our ability anymore. We here in Pallium ourselves, initially when this first came up, we had to think about scaling back our home visits and our home care because a lot of things were up in the air. We were worried about the safety of our teams, most importantly worried about the safety of patients and their families. And all of that really affected the work that we do. And we had to reorganize our services to fit in with the new normal that was upon us. So what current evidence do we have on COVID-19? We have studies and surveys coming in from China and Italy, two of the most hard-hit countries in the world. And what we are learning from them is that in China, the psychological impact was on 53.8%. Of the 53.8% of respondents was moderate to severe. 28.8% had severe anxiety problems. 16.5% report moderate to severe depression. 8.1% reported high levels of stress. Italy, we saw high levels of anxiety in 73.9% of those surveyed, which was a size of 3,452 people. The risk of psychological morbidity is higher amongst the elderly, the vulnerable, and women. That's an interesting thing actually to unpack and look at in more detail when you have the time. Integrated psychological interventions on all levels have been shown to reduce the risk of mental health morbidity and promote social stability. So there is no doubt that psychological intervention is very sorely needed. And one of the things perhaps that this pandemic is revealing is the importance of mental health. It's making mental health as an issue much more visible than it has ever been. And I hope, as a mental health professional, I really hope that the importance of it remains even after we're past the crisis. So some of the most common psychological issues that we see, firstly, how are psychological issues expressed, right? So they're expressed as emotional distress, they're manifested as unhealthy behaviors, and in the context of COVID, especially non-compliance with public health directives. Right? We know, we've seen on the news, and we constantly hear stories about people who will defy guidelines, who will be out there at much risk to themselves and to others. And this does sort of indicate a certain amount of psychological maladaptation. Typically, when there is an when there's an external source of stress, it has an impact on our internal cognitive world, the way we think, on our thoughts. Our thoughts then have an impact on our emotions. Our emotions have an impact on internal biological functioning and responses, and that also has an impact on our behavior. So really, it's a cycle, and we all agree that as human beings, all of these components are interconnected very, very deeply, and one can affect the other. So these are the various ways in which external stressors do affect us, and we'll go into it in more detail as we go further down. Particularly at risk at a time like this are the people listed on the screen, people who are quarantined and isolated, people who have actually contracted the disease, vulnerable populations. Now, vulnerability, there are several parameters to defining vulnerability. I will ask you to examine that in closer detail wherever you are. Vulnerable people who we recognize as vulnerable are, the elderly living alone, people living with a frail caregiver, people with comorbidities, marginalized communities. The list is quite vast. And people who encounter loss. This is a time of multiple losses. We're not just talking about loss of people, we're talking about a loss of identity, loss of roles, everything. There's been a paradigm shift in the way everything is functioning at the moment. So there are several losses that everybody's incurring. The loss of freedom to move about, the loss of your ability to connect with other people. So there are so many losses. This is a time of multiple losses, and people who have difficulties in coping with that are also extremely at risk for psychological morbidity. Healthcare workers and carers, of course, for obvious reasons, because they're probably seeing the suffering up front, and it becomes a very central part of their work and their day. They're probably witnessing things that the general population does not get to witness. So they are also at very high risk. And I have to make a note that not all healthcare providers have a support system that they might require to tide them over this sort of mental assault in that sense. That's something for us to earmark and to talk about further down the line. So what is distress? We all have our own definitions of distress. Distress means various things to various people. But I think universally we do recognize it as a very unpleasant, uncomfortable emotional state. Nobody likes that, feeling of distress. We recognize it as something that is avoidable, that is something that we don't want to experience. And it is deeply connected with impaired coping methods. So, even the distress that is inflicted upon us from the outside, how we, the negative stimulus, the negative experiences that we encounter, the level of distress we feel largely has to do with our ability to cope and to meet the challenge. And distress has severe repercussions on our functioning on all domains. So as multifaceted entities, it would have, distress has an impact on our physical domain, on our spiritual domain, on our emotional domain. Physically, it might affect our appetite, our sleep, sexual intimacy. It affects our relationships, our interconnectedness with other people, how we relate to society at large, our spiritual world. So emotional distress is felt along all those domains. Distress is expressed as emotion. We know somebody is in distress usually by the emotion that is being expressed. So if somebody displays anger, guilt, they demonstrate guilt, they start blaming people around them, lash out, they're constantly worrying, there's a sense of hopelessness. These are all signs of distress that alert us to the fact that someone in front of us is experiencing distress. Professionals understand it under categories. So as a mental health professional, I might say, okay, this person has an anxiety disorder, is having panic attacks, is going through depression, and those are some of the broader domains. But it might also manifest in specific sort of things like burnout and existential angst, specific kinds of grief. There are different kinds of grief that people experience. So those things. So as professionals, we put them into these sort of boxes to help understand it better and provide the right kind of appropriate interventions. Okay, so this figure, what it really tells us is that health and the lack of it, which is basically illness, exist on a continuum. And I'm talking about mental health, right? So typically when you encounter various experiences in your life, a healthy response, it's normal to have mood fluctuations, and then to take things in your stride. A good way to deal, these are like good coping strategies, a good sense of humor, being in control mentally. And a lot of this comes with practices. People are not born with these traits. Some of them are more predisposed to certain traits than others, but of course all of this can be cultivated. And so basically what we're seeing on the left of the screen is all the healthy coping patterns and mechanisms. That starts to get transformed when it shows in our reactions, right? So normal mood fluctuations, how do we react to them? Is it a normal kind of response, or is it a much more pronounced, exacerbated kind of response? So like a response could be, okay, I'm a little irritable because I'm feeling a little bit moody today. But if that translates into anger or an angry outburst or aggression, then I'm slowly moving up the continuum or the spectrum into ill health in that sense. So you can take a look at this in more detail later. But so for different domains, we've talked about the different ways of reacting and how people slowly move from a healthy response to a not so healthy one. Okay. Common manifestations of psychological distress. Now, this is something that all of us are quite familiar with. Maybe I'm just sort of reaffirming what you already know in that sense. But psychological distress, like we mentioned earlier, manifests along different domains. As a human being, I have emotions. There's a physical component to my existence, my emotions and thoughts. translated to certain behavior patterns. And so there are different manifestations of psychological distress. So emotionally, I might feel stressed or overwhelmed, or I might feel anxious or worried. And this is basically emotional is to do with feeling state. Okay, so it's here. Sadness, low mood, frustration, irritability, difficulty concentrating, loss of interest in activities, trouble relaxing. I mean, I'm sure all of us have felt these things at some level or at some point or the other. Physically, there is a change to my body because of the stress or the distress that I'm experiencing. My heart rate will increase. There might be a restlessness and agitation. A lot of people, they have a stomach upset if they are distressed. Multiple aches and pains, pain in the neck, pain in the back, all kinds of things. And so it manifests physically. Behaviorally, it might manifest as in difficulty sleeping. You change your patterns in eating. A general uncomfortable sensation. This affects the way you interact with. This affects the way you interact with other people, obviously. Because if you're feeling all of these things, you're not going to respond in a normal sort of way to the people around you. And definitely, if there are pre-existing symptoms and challenges, those get worse. So this is, I think, a pretty this is a cornerstone that we're all familiar with. That if there is already a problem to begin with, if there's some sort of dysfunction, added stress only makes it worse. So if you had healthy coping patterns to begin with, you're likely to cope better. There were dysfunctional patterns, that's only going to make things worse. That's something that we see quite frequently. Health problems are affected. Obviously, there's a physical component, right? So if you were physically not so well earlier, then psychological distress will make physical health worse. And behaviorally, also, what we see is if there's somebody who has a propensity or a predisposition to substance use, they're likely to fall into that pattern, because ultimately substance use is a coping mechanism for a lot of people. We will talk about that in greater detail further down the line. There are very definite red flag signs that we need to be alert to. Agitation, confusion, disorientation, substance use, hallucination, delusions, suicidal ideation. If you have a multidisciplinary team that you work with, I would really strongly urge you to familiarize yourself, not so much in doing a suicidal risk intervention, but also to be able to recognize it when you see it. Suicide is a huge issue. Already in India, we had 1 in 5 people committing suicides because of health-related issues. It could be because of financial strain, it could have been because of unmitigated suffering or whatever. But now we're also seeing a lot of suicide, or we're seeing suicides happening amongst healthcare providers, amongst people who are being denied substances that they're dependent on, so on and so forth. So suicide is something that we need to watch out for. Okay. We've stated the problem, we familiarized you with all the various ways in which it can manifest. What do we do about it? How do we start talking about some of these rather complex issues, right? Firstly, let's remember that we're talking about psychosocial stressors and identifying distress in the COVID crisis. So firstly, to talk about COVID issues that are related directly to COVID, right? So specific COVID-related questions like about isolation, about quarantine, what are their concerns about it? What do they understand by these terms? What are their fears regarding the current crisis? And what have they lost in terms of their own personal lives, as well as for their family, and so on and so forth. So start with that, because that's the most obvious. Secondary adversities really apply to what have we lost as a result of responses to COVID, right? So COVID happened, there's a lockdown. What has that meant for you? And what has changed in your life because of this? Get down to specifics. How has it affected your social relationships? Has it affected your access to food, your access to medicines, things like that? That is on a more social, broader level. You bring it down to a more individual level and ask, okay, how has that really impacted you? How do you feel about these things? So what we're really doing is working our way to a more specific ground from a macro level to a more specific space. And once we talk about the individual, we also explore for indicators of individual vulnerability, right? In the past, how have you coped when you have been in a very stressful situation? Do you find yourself needing to use a substance in order to feel better? What do you typically do to bust stress? Things like that. So those are some of the things that we should explore. And I'm just going to introduce you to what the nurse protocol is in the next slide. The nurse protocol is a really simple way of sort of navigating this kind of a conversation, and it has proven itself to be quite a useful tool. So N stands for name or mirror the emotion. Why is it important to name an emotion? Because sometimes people feel a whole, a range of things, and there's a lot of confusion. They're not quite sure how to pin it down. But by naming an emotion, by saying, okay, you seem very angry, or you seem a little bit fearful at the moment. By naming it, you're able to pin it down, clarify it, recognize what the source of it is, and hopefully then work towards an intervention that will ease it, right? Understand the emotion. So naming it is not enough. You need to understand it. And what you're also doing is you're expressing to the person in front of you that by understanding it, you're also empathizing with them. I can imagine how stressful this is for you to not be able to see your mother at such a difficult time. So things like that. Respect the patient or the caregiver. Respecting somebody in your mind is one thing. Showing that you respect them is very, very important, and also letting them know. So sometimes positive regard and respect needs to be expressed. So that needs to be stated. Support the patient using words, and also try and mobilize support for them. Is there someone you can talk to about this? Help them sort of, very often when we're in a very stressed space, we forget about the support systems we do have. So it's good to be able to sort of direct them there, and help them to sort of remember where they have support in the past and where they can look for support right now, and how you can support them. Explore the emotion further. So once you've established all this rapport and you're starting to get deeper and deeper into the conversation, that's when you explore the emotion further and say, tell me more about these specific concerns that you have just mentioned. Okay, a quick aside to talk about stigma. Stigma is something that I think we're seeing across the country. Typically in peace times, what we call peace times, pre-COVID era, we did see that a lot of people were stigmatized based on their diagnosis, based on their geography, based on various socio-demographic, traits and parameters. But today, a really strange phenomenon is coming up where healthcare providers are being stigmatized, ostracized, discriminated against. And I don't need to go into any specific examples. I'm sure you've come across them yourselves in the news. It's been very distressing for a lot of us as a community. And it makes people wonder, why did I get into this line of work? I got into this line of work to serve, and I'm being punished for it almost. And stigma is where people are labeled, stereotyped, discriminated against, treated separately, and/or experience a loss of status. And I think across the board in India, healthcare providers are feeling this. So if you see this picture, there's something called a corona lift. Others not allowed. I mean, yes, we can understand that this was done with the idea of keeping, some safeguards or guardrails in place, but the language could have been different. But it comes across as quite discriminatory. As mentioned earlier, substance use is something that we need to talk about. Substance use, again, is something that is looked down on, it's frowned on. I want you to take a moment to reflect on the fact that substance use, as we understand it, is not a choice that people make. A lot of people feel that, oh, he just drinks because, he's weak, or it's a sign of weakness, or it's a choice that they're consciously making. Substance use and addiction issues are possibly one of the most convoluted and complex. I won't just call it a mental health problem, because it has several domains to it. It has a biological component, it has a psychosocial component, it has a spiritual and socio-political component as well. I'm not going to get into the details now. But individuals with a substance use disorder are at risk for misuse, relapse, or development of a disorder. We also need to remember that substance use and trauma have, from the beginning of time, been bedfellows. Where there is trauma, you will find substance use. There's no taking that away there's no separating the two. I'm not saying that everybody goes through trauma, resorts to substance use, but the two, as cultural phenomena, exist very, very closely together. Trauma can lead to substance use. Substance use can lead to trauma, so they feed off of each other. Those who are isolated, have lost a job. Basically, a lot of people could start using higher doses of substances, whatever it might be, alcohol or anything else, as a way of escaping their pain, as a way of escaping their stress. And or it could be that people who are heavily dependent on substances because of the lockdown and lack of access to these substances are going through severe withdrawal, and that is also causing a lot of psychological trauma. Domestic violence is something that is on the increase very, very tragically right across the world. We're hearing numbers going up, phone calls and helplines recording more and more of this for not just spouses but children and the elderly. And when you look at confined families leads to conflicts in people or partners that already have issues. Now, if a family was dysfunctional to begin with, stress will make the whole family more dysfunctional. It's pretty much how our body works. If we were dysfunctional or unwell to begin with, we're likely to get more sick. So if you see the family as an entity like that, that holds true. And what exacerbates these issues, domestic violence, substance use, or lack of availability? If somebody was used to drinking heavily and that sort of calmed them down or knocked them out, and now they don't have it, that frustration and the trauma comes out somewhere. Loss of income is a is a massive precipitating factor. Loss of roles, loss of control. It's very emasculating for men to now no longer be able to provide for their families. In places where there's extreme patriarchy and things like that, where a man's identity and self-worth is very much tied to that sort of a role, this can cause a lot of anger, and it may come out in the form of domestic violence. Fear of infection, no sense of respite, constantly being in this, in some places they call it cabin fever, just being stuck in the same place with the same people. And earlier, at least, you might go away from each other for a little while, calm down, come back, you give it some space. But here, if you're constantly in each other's faces, things are bound to escalate. Lack of social support. Maybe perhaps earlier, if there was abuse, a person could leave the house and go ask for help. Now, because of the lockdown and things like that, that sort of social support is also not there. They don't have the ability to access their churches or their temples or their mosques. So there's a sort of cumulative impact in the making. Sleep issues are common. Sleep issues could be standalone, or they could be a result of some other constellation of distressing symptoms. They could be a result of depression. They could be a result of anxiety. They could be a result of several things. And also, we know that once sleep disturbances come into the picture, then it becomes a vicious cycle. So the less you sleep, the more disturbed you are, the less rested you are, the more impaired your ability to cope with stress, and then it just starts sort of building one on top of the other. When we talk about distress, it would be incomplete to not mention spiritual distress. Each of us have a spiritual dimension, and I don't mean religion. When I speak of spirituality in this context, we're not talking about religious faith. That is a component of spirituality, but not the only one. What we're really talking about is a sense of meaning, connection, hope, things like that. All of those things that give us meaning in our lives form a part of our spiritual world. And it's a very subjective thing, unique to different people. Almost everybody has something that makes them feel connected to the world around them or gives them meaning in their life. So it is a pretty universal phenomenon. It's mysterious in the sense that it's intangible. You can't really measure someone's spirituality, and it reveals itself as we go along. It's very complex and it differs from person to person. So spiritual distress with the current pandemic, there is a sense of loss of connection because we are now isolated more and more, right? So we are losing our sense of connectedness in that sense. Yeah, we have the technology and we have WhatsApp and we have Zoom calls and things like that, but nothing quite replaces actual human contact. And a lot of people are feeling that at the moment. Loss of meaning. Why is this happening? I mean, suddenly the whole world is on its head, and my world doesn't make sense anymore. I had a plan. These were the things I was going to do in 2020. By 2021, this was going to happen. All of those plans are just up in the air now. And then I might have lost my job, and now what defines me as a person? Like if I was a teacher and that was my primary role, now that the schools are shut and I can't do that anymore. Who am I really? So these are all really existential and spiritual questions, and faith in God is also shaken in a lot of places. There's that kind of questioning, like what kind of God would allow this level of devastation to occur? So spiritual distress can be caused by several different factors. I've just sort of touched upon a few. A very, very important thing to discuss is post-traumatic stress. PTSD is something we've all heard about, and now also more than ever, the people that are most vulnerable and susceptible to this are actually healthcare workers. And trauma is actually like grief is a normal response to loss. Trauma is a normal response to an acute stressor. How we cope with it and stuff is determined by various things. But when someone has been subjected to a very, very extreme kind of stressor, and a lot of us are experiencing that at the moment, there is bound to be a prolonged sort of period of recovery, if at all. I want to sort of focus on the fact that healthcare providers are experiencing a lot of vicarious suffering, vicarious trauma, watching patients suffer. There were several people, Italian doctors, who talked about the fact that what traumatized them most was watching somebody breathless, gasping for air, agitated, and also so alone. And that was really hard for them to bear. So that is something that's going to stay with them a long time. So I fear that at the end of this pandemic, we're going to have a huge population of healthcare providers who are going to be very, very traumatized. And that is something that we need to be mindful of and start taking measures to help, at least in our own circles, at least look out for the signs. And I think with PTSD, some of the indicators are intrusive thoughts, like you constantly go back, you're constantly overwhelmed by thoughts of what you could have done, what went wrong, etc., etc., and also sleeplessness, avoiding reminders of an event, and so on and so forth. PTSD is a very vast topic, which I've just sort of maybe slightly scratched the surface of right now. Okay. This is the main algorithm that I was talking about. It's there in your ebook. It might look a bit complicated with a lot of stuff going on, but it's fairly simple to use. I'm just going to quickly take you through through it. So just remember that in the COVID crisis, most of this will probably happen over a phone call, right, rather than face to face. So when you call and you introduce yourself, figure out where the person is geographically, and then sort of work on your communication skills. Use the nurse protocol that we talked about. Use skills of reflective listening. Ask open-ended questions so that that allows for the person to narrate what is really going on rather than ask closed questions that end up in only yes or no answers. Now, because you are not physically meeting the person, you're losing a lot by way of not being able to pick up on non-verbal cues. And non-verbal cues form a very, very important part of interaction, right? So if you can't see me nodding or mirroring your body language or so on, then there's a lot of it that's lost. So in this case, what really becomes important to make sure that you have understood the person correctly is to summarize what they have said, paraphrase it, reflect it back to them. What I hear you saying is this. Did I get you correctly? So what you're telling me is that while all of this stuff is going on, your primary concern is XYZ. So always reflect back, summarize, and make sure you understood them correctly. Now, if you find, so we use something called a distress thermometer, which I will go into in just the next slide, but it's really just a sliding scale of where people are. And the higher the score, like so 0 being no distress to 10 being extreme distress. So if you just sort of ask people, okay, like this is like your pain scale. Those of you who are familiar with the pain scale, this is the distress scale. And typically if somebody is below 4 on the distress thermometer, then what is really needed is psychoeducation, and just address stressing and strengthen social support, promote daily activities. These are things that are quite easily done. But if you find that the perceived stress is a score of 4 and above, you might have to then combine these things with a little bit more in-depth counseling as well as pharmacological interventions. So you might need a psychiatrist to get on board at this point. And you need, very especially if there is absolutely no improvement with A and B, then you need to see that this is a red flag, and any of these red flags are present, then you need to refer to specialist care. This is extreme trauma, which may manifest in extremely hard to control and hard to manage manifestations, and it's not something that can be done easily. So this is typically how we go about the algorithm. I'm not going to go into much detail here. This is there in your ebook. Please take the time to go through it. These are some very helpful tips on how to manage distress. This is what the distress thermometer looks like. These things, the problems, practical problems, family problems, emotional problems, you can actually contextualize them and adapt them to your setting and to the setting that you're working in. So some might be COVID frontline, some might be more secondary, some might be palliative care settings, home care settings, things like that. So use it in the way that suits you best. And finally, how can I support somebody in distress? Right? What we said is if their distress falls below 4 on the distress thermometer, then we do a lot of psychoeducation. What does psychoeducation really mean? What are the components of psychoeducation? Psychoeducation, it requires you to form rapport. It's a therapeutic interaction. It's not just about saying, read this book or read this pamphlet. It's about clarifying what a person's understanding is of a certain issue, simplifying it, distilling it down to the most simple, salient things that they need to know. It's a two-way dialogue. It's not about you giving a didactic presentation. It's about eliciting from them what they understand, clarifying what they need clarified, and also giving them information that is relevant. There's no point me giving somebody education and information that is something that they're never going to use in their context, right? So I need to see where they are, and in the context of where they are, give them information that is most relevant. And also enhance their coping competence. So teach them little coping strategies that have been tried and tested. Tell them about it, and tell them to try and test it out, and those kind of things. Firstly, so these are some very specific steps. Check the person's knowledge. Don't just start telling them what you think they need to know. They already may be at a level of understanding that you're not aware of. So first check with them what their knowledge is, and see where the gaps are, fill in those gaps, tell him or her what he or she needs to know. Details in short sentences, no rambling, jargonized sentences. And use a language that the person understands. Don't, very often this happens where we use professional language and we say you understood, and that person says, huh, and then the person hasn't understood anything. So try and estimate what the person's language capabilities are, and then try and work in that modality. Understand what the patient knows of, perceives of the problem, what their understanding of the problem is. Elicit their feelings about it. One is to figure out what they know intellectually, but how do they feel about it, and assist to verbalize, express their emotions, and provide realistic hope. This is very, very important. Some of us have the tendency to want to, because we're uncomfortable with the uncertainty ourselves, we rush in, and we give false assurances. Don't worry, everything will be okay. Time will heal everything. We say stuff like that, which is not very realistic, and it doesn't really help the other person. So realistic hope along with emotional support is very important. And how do we help them to cope? Ventilation and validation. So what I mean by ventilation is that giving them a safe space to really express what their feelings are, validate them as people, acknowledge them as people who have the right to have these fears and concerns, that they're not being foolish, and expressing this to you. That's very important. When you're trying to solve a problem, focus on what resources a person already has and not on the deficits. What are the person's strengths? Let's focus on that rather than what their weaknesses are. In managing a big crisis, it's very difficult to give a big solution. So it's better to manage it in small, bite-sized chunks, setting small, realistic goals every day. Let's see how we can manage this. Why don't we try and do this tomorrow? So at least progress is slow, but it's steady. And a person's confidence levels also get better as they make steady progress. If they try and aim for something rather big, they may not be able to do it, and then that's going to really affect them adversely again. Patients into experts. So in the case of COVID, if there is access to patients who've had the illness and recovered, bring them into the picture, because there's really nothing like listening to a person who has been through an experience. So if you know of patients who've gone through the COVID experience, try and make them the experts and try and get them to speak to people who are experiencing psychological distress at this time. And family, don't underestimate the potential of the family unit as a source of strength. Not all families may be, so don't try and enforce it on dysfunctional families. It will make things worse. But try and see where the strength lies within the family that can help that person best. And finally, a word on bringing in meaning. It's very difficult at this time to find meaning, or at least positive meaning. But it might be difficult, but it's not impossible. And you can connect inwards. There are ways to do it. The most common, most cliche would be meditation, but meditation does not necessarily mean sitting still in one place with your eyes closed. There are different forms of meditation. This is a good time to connect with your own sense of well-being and connecting outwards. More and more people, I'm hearing about them making phone calls to friends and family more than they did when we did not have the COVID crisis. And that is something, just to reconnect with your tribe, And I think for a lot of people, it's bringing to sharp focus who are the people that are important to us in our lives, what is unnecessary, what do we really want out of relationships. And I think that's an important part of finding meaning and connecting upwards if you are so inclined. I would even say not just upwards, but connecting around. You know, there is beauty in the natural world. There's beauty in music, in art, whatever moves you. It's important to connect with that. So, in summary, mental health issues are significant in the context of COVID-19, with specific challenges to be aware of. It's important to identify, assess, and manage psychosocial issues, and it can be done by a primary care team. You don't need a specialist team at all times, only when you have the red flags that appear. Addressing spiritual needs to deliver total care. Please do not undermine the importance of spirituality and meaning at this time. Sometimes that is the most powerful therapeutic intervention. Algorithms and supporting documents are found in the ebook, very easy to follow and use in practice. And should you have any doubts regarding any of that, we're happy to assist. So I'm going to stop with this. Also in the ebook, there are several resources and training links. Please go through those. And I'm sure you'll find a lot of stuff that will enhance your practice. So thank you. And
thank you, Smriti. So the session is open for discussion now. Yeah, I mean.
Hello.
Yes,
Thank you for
Manu.
the question, ma'am. I had a question regarding the scoring mentioned in the algorithm in ebook, like how to score more than 4 on the distress thermometer. So I didn't get that part of the algorithm.
It's a subjective scoring tool. Just like you would ask somebody to score their pain, so it's really a subjective. It's a subjective sort of response that you're eliciting, Dr. Sunil. That's how
so
the algorithm.
if you ask the person, we are scoring the pain. Can you score the pain from 0 to 10? 0 means no pain and 10 means first imaginary pain. So likewise, you can also use the distress thermometer by telling the patient if you feel no emotional distress, it is 0, and if you feel it's maximum or the worst, it is 10. So can you score in between? And the score indicates, suppose it is say 7, 8, that means we need to do some interventions. Otherwise, they may go into some other problems like anxiety going into depression, or even they may go for suicide. So that's how we can use the distress thermometer to find out the emotional distress.
So that's also to be combined with your own communication skills. Now, just because someone tells me they're 10 doesn't mean I immediately, get some super specialist care. I need to explore with them why do you say it's 10, right? And so then he might say, I'm not being able to sleep, I'm not being able to do this, I'm not going to be able to do that. And so a little bit of exploration, of course, is very necessary. If somebody tells me, God, I feel like a 6. Yesterday I was a 9, but today I'm a 6. And I'm going to ask them, what changed for you to feel better, right? Similarly, see, I mean, I'm no doctor, I'm a psychologist, but if someone comes to us and says to score physical pain and they say it's 9 on 10, it is a subjective experience. What feels like a 4 on 10 for you may not feel like a 4 on 10 for me. It feels like a 9 or 10 simply because I'm having a horrible day at work and that headache feels so much worse. So similarly, distress is subjective. I would follow up that with a conversation and then determine the level of intervention.
Anybody else has any comments or questions? So, Sister Nirmala says nurse protocol was something new to her. It is very useful.
Smriti, as there don't seem to be any other questions, I was wondering whether we shouldn't bring in some of the issues brought in by the poor access to real meaningful contact. In the sense, we are advised not to touch people unless it's absolutely essential, not to go too close. Say, maintain a distance as much as possible. Wear professional protection equipment. You are not able to see, convey anything with your face even, or gestures. So maybe some of those issues, they are very real. So how, like, we perhaps could bring in how still to maintain a relationship even with professional protection equipment. So things like getting the person to speak more. I don't know if there are COVID treating healthcare providers in the group, in which case maybe they will have some things to offer themselves.
Well, I would imagine that yes, with the barriers that COVID brings, um, physical distance, masks, not being able to touch, so on and so forth. Fine, there are no people working directly with COVID patients at the moment, but that sort of a scenario also arises in a country like India, where not everybody is able to physically come to where you are. Sometimes you have to reach people on the phone, and that is sometimes as much a barrier, I think. So I know there's a vast difference between the COVID context and just not being there in the same geographical area, but I think language is really important, and tone and cadence. Cadence is the sort of the way in which you you convey to somebody, right? So uh, I can convey to somebody that I would like to know more. I'd like to listen by using silence as well, by using the right words, by expanding my own emotional vocabulary. I think just as a doctor needs to constantly upgrade their medical skills, um, effective communicators, if you aspire to be an effective communicator, which is such an important part of providing healthcare, that is a skill that we constantly need to hone as well. If I keep using, you sound depressed, somebody might sound something, so I need to expand my emotional vocabulary in order to convey more accurate terms. Obviously, being mindful of the cultural context. I cannot use words of Western origin in a, say, remote village in some part of India, right? They're not going to understand me. Similarly, I should avoid using jargon. I should try and match their modality the best. If I find that they're very slow speakers, I need to be patient and probably, hone the skill of directing the conversation in a particular direction. So I think there are ways to make a person feel heard, uh, even when there are barriers in place. But then that's our responsibility.
So Rona asked, cancer patient has fear that they have high chance of COVID-19 and asked me they not to go to one hospital because of corona. So this fear create that they not want to treatment like chemo. So how handle this such questions? So, Rona, this is real because we know that the patients are immunocompromised, and when they contract COVID, then there is a high mortality also. The question is real, and so I recently had an interview with an oncologist, and he was suggesting that the first thing is that they should have real information regarding the COVID. There will be many things that going in social media which may not be correct. So this is what usually people see, and they understand that's correct. So correct information should be passed on. Second thing is that the oncologist was telling that there are some chemotherapeutic regimes which can be delayed or which can be continued, and sometimes it can be continued over the phone. So these are some suggestions that he was giving, but there are some chemotherapeutic regimes for which the patient need to go, so that we should tell the patient what are the benefits of doing this, and what are the harm if you delay the chemotherapy. So that information should be given to the patient. Anybody else? Sir, do you have anything to add?
No, I'm sure if we give time, many members of the group would have more issues to bring up. This has been quite a lot of matter provided to them. Maybe people are feeling a bit overwhelmed. I don't know. But I'm sure if you give them another minute, some people will have some questions to bring up. Smriti, if there are no questions, can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
Maybe you share the screen again and show, I mean, like the second algorithm that you showed was a little
Complex.
too small letters there, so not easy to read. Maybe the earlier one. And then going into specific issues and seeing people have any questions regarding the particular issue, that may be worthwhile.
Is this the one?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not sure how to zoom into this.
Smriti, and maybe see, here we talk about the perceived distress, and we are going on to psychoeducation. That's one thing that I thought we could, I mean, just bring in the value of listening there.
Yeah.
And that was one thing. The other thing, I mean, somebody asked about the distress thermometer. Maybe by showing the picture again and explaining it, I mean, many people would find that a very useful tool. I mean, like, if you make a demonstration right now, asking the people, I mean, like, thinking when you think about COVID, then explain the tool, like, do you feel a distress? And what is 0? And explain what is 10, and see how much that is. What was the distress that you felt in personal life with certain events? And I think that will clarify it also. So the first thing that I was mentioning was, it sounded a little too technical to go straight to psychoeducation, and maybe bridge it by bringing listening and making it real. The second was more explanation of the distress thermometer that I had to suggest.
No, great suggestions. So this is a tool that has been borrowed. This is not obviously from the COVID context, which is why we talked about contextualizing it. Okay, so that may not be something that everybody feels that they are able to do. But okay, so if I were to say, I if I were to ask Dr. Sunil, okay, so where are you on the distress thermometer ever since this, COVID crisis began? And you give me a number, Dr. Sunil. Um,
7.
okay, so Dr. Sunil is at 7, which is, if 10 is extreme distress and 0 is no distress, he has a significant amount of distress. So what I'm then going to do is I'm going to ask him to, Dr. Sunil, 7 seems like that you're experiencing a lot of distress. And do you want to tell me a little bit more about, is anything specific that is worrying you? Or, do you want to tell me what your biggest worries are right now?
It's about fear that whether the COVID is going to come here, and I don't know whether I am going to contract COVID. And I am working as a healthcare professional, and am I going to give this infection to one of my loved one, or will I be the one who is going to be the super spreader? I don't know. So, and even I have some comorbidities, so that's also causing distress for me.
So when you say distress, can you tell me a little bit more? Are you, for example, are you having difficulty sleeping, or are you is
Yeah. I had problems with sleep and fear. So those are some problems which I had associated with that distress. And mood was not good. It was gloomy.
has this affected your work in any way?
It doesn't. No, it did not. I could work, but it was causing some distress.
Okay, and what about your relationship with your family? Is there some
Yeah, there was
tension?
decreased conversation with the family.
Okay,
Don't want to talk.
all right, sorry, I cut Dr. Sunil off. That was just to demonstrate like how that would go. Like once I asked him a score, I would probably check his physical, how it's impacted his physical domain, how it's impacted his family, his functionality, what emotions he's feeling, things like that. So the way I did it is probably a very compressed sort of, demonstration. But I would go into more detail about these things and to see to what extent he's feeling it. And by clarifying it, and eventually I would probably go into helping him name and identify the emotion, so I'm better able to help him cope with that emotion or with that thought. I will also probably study how a particular thought is impacting his feeling state and what that is translating to in his behavior. Is the anxiety he's feeling causing him to do something that is not very healthy, so things like that. I hope that has been helpful, Dr. Raj.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much.
And Manveen, you had the question about the thermometer. So was this interaction helpful to you in any way?
Yes, ma'am. I now got this second part of the whole thermometer thing. The questions about practical problems and family problems. This was really helpful.
Okay, great. Dr. Raj, thank you actually for prodding us in that direction. So, Manveen, one of the things that I just again like to bring your attention to is the fact that right now on the screen it says practical problem, family problem, this, that. So, this will need to be customized to your setting and the demographic you see. Yeah, but I think you'd be quite well versed in how to sort of pin that. Okay.
And especially the nurse protocol that you shared, it was very novel. And I think it's a comment, it's not a question, but that will help us as colleagues to talk to each other, because I see so many of my friends working in the COVID block distressed, but we don't really have that mechanism of talking, of initiating the conversation. So these 5 words, the way to go about expressing emotions. It is very new for me. I've read it for the first time. I read it in the ebook in the morning, but this is very helpful.
Thank you. I'm glad you think so. And I think the best sort of protocols are elegant in their simplicity.
Yes.
So this is fairly simple. And to me, when I imagine using this protocol, there is a flow to it. It would need to be worked into a conversation rather than a checklist. So yeah. So it's thank you. I'm glad you found it useful.
So I think our time is up. So thank you, Smriti, for this wonderful session and making it practical by demonstrating. And thank you all those who has interacted, and thank you all who has signed in for today's echo. Before you leave, please do this feedback questionnaire and please submit it so that we can improve our sessions further. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Be safe.